I stayed awake past midnight on the couch with the lamp off. The house quiet and that hollow way it gets when you know sleep is pretending to be nearby but will not come. And when Lauren finally came in, she smelled like citrus vodka and someone else's perfume layered over her own. Kicked off her shoes without looking at me and started talking before I could even stand up, not slurring exactly but loose, confident, like she had rehearsed this speech in the mirror of a bar bathroom and was. Relieved to finally deliver it to an audience that could not leave. She talked about how fun it had been, how good it felt to laugh without checking the time, how alive she felt dancing to songs she said she forgot she loved, and the way she said alive carried an edge that made the word feel like an accusation. She sat across from me and crossed her legs, steadying herself with the arm of the chair, and said comfort isn't love as if it were a quote she'd memorized, as if it explained everything without needing to explain anything at all, and I watched her eyes search my face for reaction while she kept going, saying she cared about me, that I was her best friend, that I had been good to her in all the ways that mattered on paper, and then she said she wasn't in love with me anymore with a soft smile that suggested honesty was supposed to soften the blow, that truth was a gift she was handing me even if it cut my hands. I felt the weight of the words settle in my chest like furniture being rearranged without my permission, but I did not interrupt her because I recognized the shape of what she was doing, the careful framing that let her feel brave instead of cruel, and when she paused, she waited, eyebrows lifted, chin tilted, prepared for tears or bargaining or the old familiar work of managing my feelings. I gave her none of it. I nodded once, slow, the way you do when you hear a diagnosis that confirms something you already suspected but hoped you were wrong about. And I said, I understood that caring without being in love was still caring, and that honesty was important, and that I appreciate her telling me plainly. And I meant every word in the narrow, precise way you mean things when you are building a wall brick by brick. The room felt suddenly too clean, like a hotel lobby after midnight, and she kept talking, filling the space I refused to fill, explaining excitement and freedom and how she needed to feel chosen by herself again, how she didn't want to hurt me, how she expected this to be hard but necessary, and with each sentence her voice grew more insistent, as if my calm was not the response she had prepared for, as if my lack of protest threatened the narrative she needed to believe. I stayed still, hands folded, breathing even, because somewhere beneath the shock a quieter understanding had settled, the understanding that begging would not turn care into love, that reassurance would not resurrect what she had already pronounced dead, and that the absence she feared was not my sadness, but my refusal to perform it. When she finally stopped, the silence stretched, and she looked almost disappointed, and I realized then that what she wanted was not forgiveness or resolution, but reflection, proof that her confession mattered because it broke something visible. I stood up, turned off the lamp, and said I was in bed, my voice steady enough to surprise us both, and as I walked away I felt the night rearrange itself around me, not dramatic or loud, just final. The way doors close when you do not rush to hold. Them open, she waited for something explosive to happen after that night, and I could feel in the way she hovered the next morning, in the way her eyes kept checking my posture and my tone like instruments measuring turbulence. But nothing came, because something in me had already gone quiet. When she repeated herself over coffee, more sober and more careful, clarifying that she had not meant to be cruel, that she just wanted to be honest, I acknowledged it the same way I acknowledge a weather report, noting the conditions without trying to argue the sky into changing. I told her I heard her, that I believed her, and that I was taking her words seriously, and the calm in my voice seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever could. She circled for an explanation from me, for context or defense or self-criticism, but I realized in real time that I had spent years explaining myself to maintain equilibrium, translating my needs into smaller shapes, so they would fit into the space she left, carrying the emotional weight quietly so nothing would tip over. That morning, as she spoke, I observed rather than participated, noticing how often I've been the one smoothing conversations, anticipating moods, absorbing dissatisfaction without naming it, and how her confession did not arrive as a shock, but as confirmation. I felt no urge to convince her of my value, or to negotiate affection back into existence, because the realization landed fully formed and unexpectedly solid, the realization that love does not require constant justification from only one side. There was no dramatic heartbreak swelling in my chest, no cinematic grief, just a steady internal shift, like a ledger being updated after years of incorrect entries. I recognized patterns that had once seemed like isolated moments, the way she spoke of freedom as something she accessed elsewhere, the way my steadiness had been rebranded as predictability, the way I had mistaken endurance for intimacy, and instead of spiraling I categorized it, the way I do at work when a system failure finally reveals its root cause. That night stopped being a personal failure and became a data point, one clear input among many that told a consistent story when I allowed myself to read it honestly. I did not sleep much, but I rested in a different way, letting go of the need to prepare speeches or apologies or promises that had never truly been requested, only expected. When Lauren watched me move through the house without tension or pursuit, when she realized I was not gearing up to fight for reassurance or rewriting myself to be chosen again, there was a flicker of confusion in her expression, and I understood then how much of our dynamic had depended on my willingness to carry uncertainty for both of us. I took her words literally, not defensively or dramatically, but with the same precision I bring to every serious decision, accepting that care without being loved was her truth, and that my response did not need to decorate with emotion to make it valid. The silence that followed was not punishment or strategy. It was clarity. And within it I felt something settle into place that had been misaligned for a long time, the understanding that I did not need to explain myself anymore, to be heard by someone who had already decided what they felt. Over the next few days, I did not confront her or announce any decision, because confrontation would have implied I was still trying to change the outcome, and instead I subtracted myself quietly from the spaces where I had always been expected to show up. I stopped reminding her about appointments, deadlines, birthdays, and small obligations she had grown used to outsourcing to my attention, and when she forgot something I did not rush to fix it or soften the consequences. I simply let the omission exist. I stopped checking in emotionally, stopped asking how she slept or how her day went, not out of spite, but because I finally noticed how rarely those questions traveled in the other direction without prompting. I canceled events we had planned together without dramatizing it, telling her calmly that I would not be attending, and I declined invitations that required me to perform the role of a connected partner when the connection itself had already been redefined by her words. I stopped doing favors that were framed as mutual but always landed on my time and energy, no last-minute errands, no rearranging my schedule to accommodate her spontaneity, no smoothing logistics behind the scenes. So things appeared effortless. Instead, I began living as an independent adult under the same roof, cooking my own meals without coordinating menus, managing my own calendar without syncing it to hers, leaving the house without explanation, and returning without report, my movements neutral and unremarkable in a way that felt strangely liberating. The absence was immediate and tangible, not loud but unmistakable, like the hum of an appliance turning off in a quiet room, and I could see her registered in small ways, in the pauses where she waited for prompts that never came, in the glances she threw my way as if checking whether I was about to step back into familiar rhythm. She grew uneasy not because I was cruel or distant in any overt sense, but because the structure she leaned on had dissolved without warning, and I understood then how much of her sense of stability had come from my emotional availability rather than from shared intention. She tried casual conversation that drifted into fishing for reassurance, comments about how different things felt, how quiet the house seemed, and I responded politely without filling the gap she left open, without translating my silence into comfort. I noticed how often she lingered near me, how she recalibrated her tone, as if searching for the frequency that used to draw me in, and I felt no satisfaction in it, only clarity. This was not punishment or strategy. It was alignment, the natural result of taking her words at face value and adjusting my behavior accordingly. When I stopped carrying emotional labor by default, the imbalance became visible in a way it never had when I was compensating for it, and I could see her grappling with the loss of something she had not realized she depended on until it was gone. I did not announce boundaries or demand acknowledgement. I simply removed the constant availability that had blurred into entitlement, and in doing so I felt my internal world settle into a quieter, more ordered state. The power she held was never about control or manipulation. It had come from my willingness to be endlessly accessible, endlessly responsive, and once that willingness was withdrawn without anger or explanation, the dynamic shifted on its own, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but exact, a silence that reflected reality as it was rather than as I had been working to maintain. Her confusion hardened into accusation once it became clear that the old dynamics were not snapping back into place, and she finally said out loud one evening, telling me I was being cold, that I was punishing her for being honest, that this quiet withdrawal felt calculated and unfair. I listened without interrupting, noticing how quickly her language shifted from uncertainty to blame, and when she finished I told her evenly that I was not punishing her at all, that I was simply accepting what she had said and adjusting my behavior to match it. I explained that if she was not in love with me, then it made sense for me to stop acting like the emotional anchor of marriage that no longer existed in the way it once did, and I said it without heat or bitterness, which only seemed to frustrate her more. She oscillated after that, sometimes within the same day, moving from guilt to nostalgia to irritation, as if cycling through strategies to see which one would unlock the version of me she expected to return. One morning, she brought home food from a place we used to love, setting it on the counter with exaggerated casualness, and telling me she thought I might like it, watching my reaction carefully as I thanked her and ate without commentary. Another night, she suggested we do a date night, framed as something light and easy, a way to reconnect without pressure. And when I declined calmly and said I was not interested in pretending we were something she had already told me we were not, her face tightened in a way that revealed how much she had expected compliance. She began reopening old memories, referencing trips we took years ago, inside jokes, moments she framed as proof that what we had was real and worth saving. And I acknowledged those memories without using them to bridge the present, recognizing them as history rather than leverage. I no longer rushed to fill the gap she created with reassurance or emotional labor, and the silence I left behind started working against her, not because it was weaponized, but because it refused to cooperate with the narrative she was trying to rebuild. She would trail off mid-sentence and look at me, waiting for encouragement or softening, and when none came she would grow visibly unsettled, as if the absence itself was an accusation she could not argue with. I stayed consistent, not defensive or withdrawn, just precise, responding to what was said without extrapolating or compensating. And in doing so, I could see how much of our past connection had depended on my willingness to interpret, soothe, and absorb. The more she accused me of being distant, the clearer it became that what she missed was not closeness, but access, the certainty that I would always be there to stabilize her uncertainty, while setting my own aside. I did not raise my voice or list grievances or demand accountability, because those actions belonged to a version of the relationship that required mutual investment, and she had already named the limits of hers. As days passed, her attempts grew less subtle, small touches lingering a beat too long, comments about how other couples work through phases like this, moments of irritation when my calm did not crack into engagement, and through it all I remained steady, not withholding, but no longer overextending. The silence was no longer something I endured. It was something I occupied deliberately, and within it I felt grounded rather than abandoned. What unsettled her was not that I had changed, but that I had stopped compensating, and without my constant presence filling the emotional space, she was left facing the shape of what she had chosen, a shape she seemed increasingly uncomfortable sitting with as the quiet stretched on without rescuing her from it. Lauren started leaning outward instead of inward, and I could see in the way her phone never left her hand, and in the sudden frequency of girls' nights that stretched into long weekends of supposed self-discovery. One friend in particular became a constant presence, the kind who spoke in affirmations and slogans, who framed every doubt as evidence of growth, and every discomfort as proof of bravery, and Lauren absorbed that language quickly, repeating it like a shield. Her social media shifted tone almost overnight, photos bathed in good lighting with captions about choosing herself, about freedom, about strength, about finally listening to her own voice. And from the outside, it probably looked convincing, like the clean art of a woman stepping into her power. Inside the house, though, the reality felt thinner, more fragile, and I noticed how often she checked whether I had seen a post, how she lingered near me after coming home energized from validation elsewhere, as if expecting the same reflection she was getting from her friends. What she did not anticipate was that while she was curating an image of empowerment, I was quietly stabilizing into something real. With the emotional noise gone, my focus at work sharpened in a way it had not for years. Projects that once felt draining now felt straightforward, and colleagues commented on the clarity of my thinking and consistency of my presence. I started reconnecting socially, not in a performative way, but naturally, accepting invitations I had once declined out of obligation to the marriage, rediscovering how easy it was to be myself without managing someone else's mood in the background. My evenings filled with routines that grounded me, workouts that left me clear-headed, dinners eaten without tension, conversations that did not require translation or restraint, and I felt emotionally stable in a way that surprised me, not euphoric or detached, just balanced. The contrast between us became impossible to ignore, and I could see the realization forming slowly on her face as days passed, the subtle shift from confidence to unease when she noticed I was not unraveling. She had expected guilt or collapse, some visible consequence that confirmed her narrative of necessary pain leading to growth. But instead she watched me move forward without spectacle, and that quiet confidence seemed to unsettle her more than anger ever could. At home, the empowered version of herself she projected online struggled to reconcile with the absence of influence she now felt over me, and the encouragement she received from friends did not translate into leverage when the door closed behind her. I could see her recalculating in small ways, asking about my schedule, commenting on my energy, observing how little effort it took for me to maintain momentum without her involvement. And for the first time there was hesitation in her certainty the validation she gathered externally was loud but fleeting, while the consequences unfolding internally were steady and undeniable. And I sensed the moment she realized she might have miscalculated, not because I had changed into someone unrecognizable, but because I had become more myself. Without her at the center, there was no dramatic confrontation or reversal, just an emerging awareness that independence framed as empowerment feels different when the person you expected to orbit no longer does. And that truth settled between us quietly, heavy in its implications. As I continued living forward with a calm she could no longer reinterpret as weakness, the shift into panic was sudden and unmistakable, even though she tried to dress it up as intention. And almost overnight, Lauren rebranded her anxiety as effort, arriving with lists of things we could work on, plans for weekends away, articles about rebuilding intimacy, therapy suggestions delivered with rehearsed optimism, and romantic gestures that felt borrowed from a version of us that no longer existed. She spoke quickly, energetically, as if momentum itself could reverse time, and I listened the same way I had been listening for weeks, present but no longer pliable, attentive without negotiating. I could see how urgent it all felt to her, how the confidence she had worn so comfortably before it cracked once she realized I was not waiting for her to circle back, and that urgency colored everything she did. The surprise dinners, the sudden affection, the promises framed as realizations she wished she had reached sooner. I let her speak without cutting her off, without correcting her language or matching her intensity. And when she finally paused, I told her calmly that I understood she was a footstep, but that wanting to fix something after emotionally abandoning it was not a race to happen with her. I explained that when she told me she was no longer in love with me, I believed her, and I reorganized my inner world around that truth. That process did not reverse simply because consequences had been taken. She tried to frame her firm honesty as bravery, as a necessary step to her growth, and I agreed that it was honest. But I also told her that honesty carried weight, and one spoke of changing the shape of her collar when it was ultimate for her. The gestures kept coming anyway, those left in counter, suggestions of therapy was already received, comments about how other people should mind, and I acknowledged each one without committing any of it, because I was no longer bargaining for each other, requiring to forget what had already been told to us. I told her that effort offered after distance feels different from effort offered through. That repair requires continuity, not panic, and that the space I created beside myself could not be rushed closed just because she was afraid of it now. Her frustration leaked through the optimism in small ways, sighs when I did not respond the way she hoped, irritation when my calm did not turn into reassurance, moments where the mask slipped and I could see the fear underneath, the fear of having lost something she assumed would always be available. I did not raise my voice or harden my tone, but I did not soften my position either, and that steadiness seemed to exhaust her more than resistance would have. I explained that I was no longer negotiating my emotional reality to make hers easier, that I had already adjusted to the truth she gave me, and that reversing course would require pretending I had not felt the ground shift beneath my feet. When she stepped away from the marriage, emotionally the hardest part for her, I think, was realizing that this was not a debate she could win with better arguments or more effort, because the outcome was no longer in her control, and the honesty she once wielded so confidently had set limits she could not walk back. I remained consistent, not punitive or closed off, just resolved. And in that resolve there was no anger left to mine, no chaos to fix, only the quiet certainty that some moments permanently alter the direction of a relationship, and no amount of late arriving urgency can return things to the shape they held before that moment occurred. The transition from marriage to logistics happened without ceremony, and once it started it felt almost inevitable, like a system switching modes after a threshold had been crossed. I moved into the guest room one morning with the same quiet efficiency I brought to everything else, carrying only what I needed and leaving the rest untouched, not as a statement, but as a practical adjustment to reality we were already living. The physical separation clarified things immediately, not emotionally, but structurally, and within days I began planning my exit with the same focus I applied at work, researching options, timelines, and processes without dramatizing any of it. I contacted a mediator rather than a lawyer because I was not interested in escalation or punishment, only resolution, and when I told Lauren I had done, so I framed it as a step toward clarity rather than conflict. The conversations that followed were calm, almost clinical, centered on finances, assets, and next steps, and I noticed how disoriented she seemed by my consistency, by the absence of emotional spikes she could react to or redirect. We discussed accounts, property, and share expenses with factual precision, and I stuck to verifiable information, dates, and numbers, refusing to drift into blame or revisionist history, even when she tried to pull the conversation there. When she involved her parents, I recognized it immediately for what it was, an attempt to reintroduce pressure where influence had slipped away, and I did not resist it because resistance would have implied vulnerability. I met their concern with the same steadiness, explaining my decisions clearly, outlining the process I was following, and refusing to engage in character debates or emotional arbitration. There was no villain speech because I did not need one, and I did not present myself as wrong or righteous, only resolve, which seemed to frustrate everyone involved more than anger ever could have. Lauren oscillated between pleading and indignation during this phase, Sometimes accusing me of giving up too easily, other times insisting this was not who I really was, as if consistency itself were a phase I might abandon under enough pressure. I did not correct her perception or argue for my identity, because I understood that my role in her narrative was no longer something I needed to manage. I set boundaries and followed through on them, scheduling meetings, documenting agreements, and maintaining a routine that reflected forward motion rather than limbo. The house became a shared space in name only, and our interactions narrowed to necessary exchanges handled with politeness and distance, stripped of the emotional improvisation that had once defined us. I felt no triumph in this, no satisfaction in her discomfort, only a growing sense of alignment between my actions and my internal reality. The absence of drama was not accidental. It was deliberate, the result of choosing follow-through over performance, and as the logistics took shape, it became clear that control was no longer something she could reclaim through urgency or outside influence. I did not need to convince anyone that this was the right path, because I was already walking it, and the steadiness of that movement rendered arguments irrelevant. What remained was process, not passion, and I engaged with it fully, knowing that boundaries mean little without execution, and that clarity, once chosen, requires consistency rather than explanation. To hold the exit itself was clean and quiet, almost anticlimactic. And when the day came for me moving to my own apartment, there was no yelling, no last-minute arguments, no emotional explosions meant to rewrite the ending into something more dramatic. I packed what I needed, loaded my car carefully, and walked to the house one last time without nostalgia pulling at me, noticing instead how neutral everything felt once I stopped assigning it meaning it no longer carried. Lauren hovered the edges of the process, uncertain and subdued, as if waiting for a final confrontation that never arrived, and I gave her none, because there was nothing left to defend or accuse. When I closed the door behind me, it did not feel like escape or victory. It felt like completion, the end of a sequence that had already resolved internally long before the logistics caught up. My new apartment was modest but intentional, arranged around function and calm rather than compromise. And the first night, I slept there. I noticed the absence of tension more than the presence of solitude. I rebuilt my life deliberately, centering on respect and choice instead of endurance, filling my time with work that engaged me, routines that supported me, and relationships that did not require me to shrink or overextend to be accepted. There was no urge to monitor Lauren's life from a distance, no satisfaction in imagining her discomfort, because what mattered was not how she processed the aftermath, but how clearly I understood it. Her truth, spoken without malice but without care for its impact, had ended the marriage, not cruelty, not betrayal, not infidelity, just words stated plainly and believed fully, and once believed they could not be unspoken. I knew she was left sitting with that reality, with the understanding that honesty does not exist in a vacuum, and that some truths, once released, alter the structure of a relationship beyond repair. I did not need her to admit regret or assign blame, because clarity does not depend on confession. It depends on alignment, and mine was finally complete. As the weeks passed, I felt lighter in a way that had nothing to do with freedom in the abstract, and everything to do with no longer tolerating a dynamic that required constant self-negotiation. I moved forward without bitterness, without rewriting the past into something monstrous, acknowledging that what we had was real and that its ending was also real, shaped by choices rather than villains. The quiet that followed was not emptiness but space. Space to live without bracing myself emotionally. Space to invest where effort was met rather than absorbed. Space to exist without waiting to be chosen by someone who had already chosen differently. I carried one certainty with me into this next chapter, not as a vow made in anger, but as a conclusion earned through experience, that I would never again beg to be loved, never again translate my worth into smaller terms to fit someone else's. Uncertainty, and never again mistake tolerance for intimacy. Walking away did not feel like loss. It felt like accuracy, and in that accuracy there was peace, the kind that comes not from being right, but from finally being done.